What you're about to hear is not a prediction. It is not a scenario from a war game simulation run at some Washington think tank. It is happening right now, in real time, and the consequences of what Iran did in the last 18 hours will reach into your bank account, your gas station, your grocery store, and the pension fund that is supposed to secure your retirement. The Islamic Republic of Iran has moved to functionally block the Strait of Hormuz, and the global economy, which has been running on the assumption that this choke point would remain open, has approximately hours, not weeks, before the full weight of that decision lands on every market, every supply chain, and every government on Earth. Here is what actually happened. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval forces, operating under orders issued directly from the Supreme National Security Council in Tehran, deployed a combination of naval mines, fast attack craft, and shore-based anti-fighting ship missile batteries in a coordinated pattern designed to make commercial transit through the eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz effectively impossible without Iranian permission and Iranian escort. This is not a full physical blockade in the traditional military sense. Iran lacks the conventional naval power to enforce that against American opposition. What it is, precisely, is a threat-based closure. A signal transmitted through mines in the water and missiles locked onto tanker radar signatures that says, if you transit without our approval, you will not arrive. The insurance market understood the message within 90 minutes. Lloyd's of London suspended war risk coverage for the Strait of Hormuz transit corridor before the close of business in London. Without war risk coverage, no commercially operated tanker on Earth can legally sail through that water. The closure is not enforced by Iranian guns. It is enforced by actuarial tables, and it is already total. To understand why this is the most consequential single event in global energy markets since the 1973 Arab oil embargo, you need to hold one number in your mind: 21 million barrels of oil per day. That is the volume of crude oil, refined products, and liquefied natural gas that transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day before this crisis began. 21 million barrels. That is roughly 20% of all the oil consumed by every human being on the planet every day. Japan gets 83% of its imported crude through this water. South Korea gets 78%, India gets 65%, China, the world's largest oil importer, gets nearly 70% of its imports through the strait. Even Europe, which has worked for years to diversify away from Gulf energy, has significant exposure through refined product imports and LNG contracts. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely important to global energy supply. It is the single most critical choke point in the entire architecture of the modern global economy. And it is closed. Now here is the part that most people, including most professional analysts who are currently appearing on financial news channels, are significantly underestimating. The spare capacity that was supposed to serve as the buffer against exactly this scenario is not where the official numbers said it would be. Saudi Arabia's claimed spare production capacity of approximately 2 million barrels per day has been the bedrock assumption of every energy security analysis written in the last decade. The theory was always the same. If the Gulf gets disrupted, Riyadh opens the taps, prices spike but stabilize, the world absorbs the shock. That theory has one devastating flaw, which is now being exposed in real time. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura terminal, the largest crude oil export terminal on Earth, handling approximately 6.5 million barrels per day of Saudi export volume, sits on the western shore of the Persian Gulf. To get Saudi oil to world markets, it must either transit the Strait of Hormuz or move through the east-west pipeline to Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. The east-west pipeline has a capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia exports approximately 7 million barrels per day. The arithmetic is brutal and immediate. Even if Saudi Arabia pumps at full theoretical capacity, it cannot get all of its oil to market without Hormuz access. The backup is real, but it is not big enough. The buffer the world was counting on has a hole in it. This brings us to the price. By the time Asian markets opened this morning, Brent crude had already moved from $89 per barrel, where it was trading before news of the Iranian naval deployment broke, to $131. That is a 47% move in under 12 hours, which is one of the largest single-session crude oil price dislocations in recorded market history. But $131 is not the number that matters. The number that matters is what happens if this closure holds for more than 72 hours. Goldman Sachs Energy Desk, JP Morgan Commodity Strategy, and the independent analysts at Energy Aspects have all run versions of the same model in the last 8 hours. Their central scenario, assuming a closure lasting 2 weeks with partial Saudi rerouting through Yanbu and emergency draws on strategic petroleum reserves in the United States, Europe, and Japan, produces a price range of $180 to $220 per barrel. The tail risk scenario, closure lasting 30 days with military escalation preventing reserve deployment, produces numbers that the analysts are not publishing because they are the kind of numbers that cause panic. But in private conversations, the figure being discussed is north of $270 per barrel. What does $200 oil actually mean for the person watching this video? It means gasoline prices at the pump in the United States move from roughly $3.40 per gallon to somewhere between $5 and $7, depending on refinery margins and regional distribution costs. It means airline ticket prices increase by 40 to 60% within 3 booking cycles, because jet fuel is the single largest operating cost for every commercial airline on Earth, and there are no hedges long enough to cover a shock of this duration and magnitude. It means food prices increase significantly and rapidly, because modern industrial agriculture is almost entirely dependent on diesel fuel for machinery, natural gas for fertilizer production, and petroleum-derived chemicals for pesticides and herbicides. A sustained period of $200 oil does not merely create inflation. It creates the specific kind of inflation, energy-driven, supply-side, hitting food and transportation simultaneously, that central banks have almost no effective tools to combat without triggering a recession so deep it would dwarf anything seen since 2008. Here is what makes Iran's strategic position in this moment genuinely sophisticated and genuinely dangerous. Tehran did not miscalculate when it decided to move on the strait. It calculated very carefully, and the conclusion it reached was that the costs of action were lower than the costs of continued inaction. Here is the logic Iran's Supreme National Security Council worked through. Israel and the United States have spent the last 18 months systematically dismantling Iran's forward deterrence architecture, destroying Hezbollah's command structure in Lebanon, degrading Hamas to a non-functional military force in Gaza, striking Iranian weapons depots in Syria, and most critically, conducting the strikes on Iranian territory that destroyed significant elements of Tehran's air defense network and damaged its nuclear enrichment infrastructure. Iran's conventional deterrent, its ability to threaten Israeli and American targets through proxies and through its own missile forces, has been substantially degraded. What remains? The Strait of Hormuz. It is Iran's last card. And Iran's leadership made the assessment that if they don't play it now, while they still have the capability and the political will to do so, they may lose the ability to play it at all. The American response is currently being finalized inside the National Security Council Situation Room, and the options being considered reveal the full depth of the strategic trap that Iran has constructed. Option 1 is direct military action to reopen the strait, using the U.S. Navy and Air Force to destroy Iranian mine-laying vessels, suppress the shore-based missile batteries, and physically clear the threat. This option is technically feasible. The United States military has the capability to execute it, but it carries a catastrophic escalation risk that every senior commander in the U.S. Central Command has flagged in the clearest possible terms. Any direct kinetic engagement with Iranian military forces inside Iranian territorial waters or on Iranian soil crosses a threshold that Iran has explicitly stated it will respond to with mass missile strikes against American bases in Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. Bases that house tens of thousands of American service members and cannot be fully evacuated or hardened against the volume of fire Iran can currently generate even in its degraded state. Reopening the strait through force means accepting American casualties at a scale that no administration since Vietnam has had to absorb. Option 2 is intensive multilateral diplomatic pressure, working through the United Nations Security Council, engaging China and Russia to pressure Tehran, and offering Iran a negotiated off-ramp that includes sanctions relief and a commitment to halt further Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. This option has a structural problem that everyone in the room understands. China has already extended its military and economic partnership with Iran to a degree that makes Beijing a deeply unreliable pressure mechanism. Russia is similarly positioned, and Iran's leadership, watching these dynamics, has specifically timed this escalation to coincide with a moment when American domestic political capacity to sustain a prolonged multilateral diplomatic effort is at a historic low. The off-ramp that Iran would accept, a complete halt to Israeli military operations, sanctions removal, and international recognition of Iran's right to a civil nuclear program, is not a package that Washington or Jerusalem can deliver in 72 hours or 72 days. Option 3, the one being discussed in the quieter corners of the foreign policy establishment, is strategic petroleum reserve releases coordinated across the International Energy Agency member states, combined with emergency outreach to non-Gulf producers to accelerate production, combined with a deliberate decision to absorb the economic shock rather than risk military escalation. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve currently holds approximately 350 million barrels, roughly 17 days of total American consumption. The IEA member states collectively hold emergency reserves, representing approximately 90 days of net import cover. A coordinated release at maximum rate could put approximately 5 to 6 million barrels per day of additional supply into the market, which partially compensates for the Hormuz closure, but does not come close to replacing it. Markets would stabilize somewhat, prices would not reach $270, but they would remain well above $150 for the duration of the closure, which, at any length beyond 3 weeks, begins producing economic damage that is genuinely severe. The country, watching all of this most carefully, and with the most complex set of interests at stake, is China. Beijing finds itself in a position of extraordinary strategic leverage and extraordinary strategic discomfort simultaneously. On one hand, China's partnership with Iran, the basing rights agreement, the weapons technology transfer, the energy contracts, gives Beijing a degree of influence over Tehran that no other external actor can match. If China wanted to bring this crisis to a rapid conclusion, it almost certainly has the means to pressure Iran in ways that Washington cannot. On the other hand, a prolonged Strait of Hormuz closure is economically devastating for China itself. 70% of Chinese oil imports transit Hormuz. Chinese manufacturing, already under significant pressure from American tariff escalation and supply chain diversification by Western companies, cannot absorb an extended period of $200 oil without severe consequences for employment, industrial output, and the social stability that the Communist Party's political legitimacy depends upon. China did not want this crisis, but China also cannot resolve it without appearing to capitulate to American pressure, which creates its own domestic political problem for Xi Jinping in a period when Chinese nationalism is a force that even the party leadership cannot afford to cross. The final piece of this picture, the one that should concern every government with a functioning bond market, is the sovereign debt dimension. The countries most immediately exposed to a sustained oil price shock are not the major Western economies, which have diverse energy mixes and significant fiscal capacity to absorb and redistribute energy costs through subsidy programs and tax adjustments. The countries most immediately exposed are the middle-income emerging market nations that import most of their energy, have limited foreign exchange reserves, and carry significant dollar-denominated debt that becomes dramatically more expensive to service when their currencies depreciate against the dollar in a flight-to-safety environment. Pakistan, Egypt, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, several sub-Saharan African nations. These are countries where energy subsidies already consume 15 to 20% of government revenue, where food imports are paid in dollars, and where the margin between fiscal stability and sovereign default is genuinely thin. A $200 oil environment sustained for 60 days does not merely create economic pain in these countries. It creates conditions for political instability, government collapse, and the kind of humanitarian crises that generate refugee flows measured in the millions. The Strait of Hormuz closure is not a regional problem, it is a global one. And the clock that matters most is not the military timeline, it is the economic one. And it started running the moment those mines hit the water.